The 23rd of March, 1951, before dawn, the cold Korean airfield at Daegu thrums with the roar of twin engines. Hundreds of US Army paratroopers wait silently beside their aircraft. The smell of oil and canvas hangs in the darkness. Each man knows he is minutes from a leap into history and perhaps his own death. Across the Korean peninsula, the war has reached a dangerous stalemate. Only months earlier, United Nations forces had driven deep into North Korea after General Douglas MacArthur's stunning amphibious landing at Incheon. Victory had seemed close, but the celebration was brief. From the vast mountains of Manchuria, waves of hardened Chinese soldiers surged south in a ferocious counteroffensive. They fought with a brutal tenacity that stunned even seasoned veterans of World War II. By early 1951, the front had frozen roughly along the 38th parallel. The momentum of the war and the fate of the Korean peninsula hung in the balance. To the north of Seoul, between the Han and Imjin rivers, tens of thousands of communist troops were dug in. They were too close for comfort, threatening the capital and waiting for the chance to break through. American intelligence warned that these forces, North Korean rifle divisions reinforced by crack Chinese units, were preparing for a massive spring offensive. If they were allowed to regroup or escape across the Imjin River, the cost in Allied lives could be catastrophic. General Matthew Ridgway, newly appointed commander of the US 8th Army, refused to let that happen. In a bold and risky maneuver, he devised Operation Courageous, a double envelopment designed to trap and annihilate the enemy pocket north of Seoul. From the south, American and South Korean infantry divisions would drive north. From the air, a daring combat parachute drop would cut off the enemy's retreat. That airborne strike, codenamed Operation Tomahawk, would be carried out by one of the Army's finest, the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team. Hardened by months of bitter mountain fighting, these paratroopers would make only the second combat jump in US Army history. Their mission? Seize the vital crossroads at Munsan-ni, hold it against overwhelming odds, and slam the door on the retreating Chinese and North Korean forces until ground armor could link up. But Ridgway's plan demanded perfect timing and iron nerves. Mines and blown bridges threatened the ground advance. The paratroopers would have only sketchy intelligence of their drop zones. And the enemy battle-hardened veterans of decades of war was entrenched on commanding hills supported by artillery and mortars. Still, the order stood. At 7:15 a.m., the first C-119 thundered down Daegu's runways. Within 2 hours, the largest single-day airborne assault of the Korean War was underway. Below, dark fields and rice paddies of enemy-held territory rushed up to meet them. This is the story of Operation Tomahawk, a high-risk strike that fused courage, improvisation, and sheer determination to change the course of the Korean War. Only 6 months before the first paratrooper left the door of his C-119, the war in Korea had swung like a pendulum. In June 1950, North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel, nearly driving the Republic of Korea and its United Nations allies into the sea. Then came MacArthur's masterstroke at Incheon, a bold amphibious landing that cut deep into the enemy flank. The sudden strike sent communist forces reeling north, past Seoul, past Pyongyang, all the way to the frigid Yalu River on China's border. Washington and Tokyo dared to believe the war might be won by Christmas, but the optimism was short-lived. Even as MacArthur's columns pressed forward, warnings filtered in through Indian diplomatic channels. Mao Zedong would never tolerate UN troops so close to Chinese soil. The reports were discounted. They should not have been. In late October, Chinese People's Volunteers, veterans of decades of warfare against both Japan and Chiang Kai, Czech's nationalists, began to appear in the mountains. By November, their presence could no longer be denied. In wave after wave, they struck the advancing UN lines with ferocity and discipline. By the time winter set in, entire American regiments were fighting for survival, retreating south through sub-zero winds and relentless human wave attacks. Through that bitter winter of 1950 to 51, General Matthew Ridgway took command of a battered 8th Army and turned retreat into resolve. Step by step, his forces dug in and counterattacked. By March 1951, they had stabilized the front roughly along the 38th parallel, but the danger was far from over. North of Seoul, Between the Han and Imjin rivers, a powerful Chinese-North Korean force, perhaps 30,000 strong, still occupied a pocket of land bristling with bunkers and artillery. The Imjin River, deep and virtually unfordable, offered them both protection and an escape corridor. From those hills, they could threaten Seoul at will or melt back into the mountains to regroup. Ridgway knew that allowing these formations to escape would mean facing them again in a renewed spring offensive. He decided the pocket had to be destroyed. The concept he approved was Operation Courageous, a double envelopment designed to trap the enemy like a closing vice. From the south, the U.S., 25th and 3rd Infantry Divisions, together with the Republic of Korea's 1st Division, would push north from Seoul. From the air, a hard-hitting parachute force would descend behind the enemy to seize the vital transport hub of Munsan-ni, severing their lines of withdrawal. The airborne component, Operation Tomahawk, would fall to the battle-tested 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team. Fresh from fierce winter fighting around Uijeongbu, the Rakkasans were among the most experienced paratroopers in the world. Alongside them would jump elements of the elite 2nd and 4th Ranger companies, specialists in lightning raids, and close-quarters combat. The plan was breathtakingly ambitious. The paratroopers would land first, seize key hills and road junctions around Munsan-ni, and hold out against unknown numbers until Task Force Growdon, a spearhead of tanks, artillery, engineers, and British bridge layers, could fight its way through mine-sown roads to link up. Every hour would count. If the link-up failed, the airborne troops could be isolated and crushed. By mid-March 1951, reconnaissance flights confirmed that Chinese and North Korean forces were digging in rather than retreating. Time was running out. Ridgway ordered the operation to begin on the 23rd of March, giving his paratroopers barely a week to prepare. What followed was a race of logistics and courage. Officers worked through the night refining drop zone data, soldiers rehearsed with scant maps and no aerial photos. Yet morale was high. As one Rakkasan remembered, "We knew it was risky, but we also knew the stakes. We were there to end this fight on our terms." With the strategy set and the drop zones barely marked, Operation Tomahawk was ready to launch a daring strike meant to slam the door on a massive communist force and change the direction of the Korean War. In the final hours of the 22nd of March, 1951, Taegu Airfield never slept. Mechanics worked by lantern light, pilots huddled over maps under canvas tents, and inside a cramped operations room, General Matthew Ridgway and his staff pored over last-minute intelligence until 1 a.m., refining a plan that had come together with astonishing speed. The paratroopers of the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team, the Rakkasans, had been told of the mission only 6 days earlier. Their original jump north of Chuncheon had been canceled, but that training now proved invaluable. Still, they were short on every luxury of preparation. There was no time for aerial reconnaissance of the drop zones. Much of the terrain information came from hastily compiled ground reports and a few hurried map sketches. By noon on the 22nd of March, crucial technical data reached battalion headquarters, allowing junior officers to brief their men. But for most rank-and-file paratroopers, the outline remained simple. Jump near Munsan-ni, seize the crossroads, and hold until the tanks arrive. They would discover the details only after their boots hit the ground. Meanwhile, Task Force Growdon, the mechanized hammer meant to meet them within 24 hours, readied for its own dangerous advance. Commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Growdon, the task force combined the 6th Medium Tank Battalion, infantry from the 7th Regiment, heavy artillery, engineers, and even British Churchill bridge-laying tanks. Their job was to smash north from Seoul through mine-sown roads and meet the paratroopers before the enemy could regroup. Opposing them were an estimated 15,000 North Korean troops, elements of the 8th and 47th Rifle Divisions and nearby Chinese formations from the 27th and 50th Armies. There were no raw recruits. Many Chinese officers and soldiers were battle-hardened veterans, forged in decades of war against Japan and in China's own civil conflict. If those enclaves merged or counterattacked before the link-up, Ridgway's daring plan could collapse into a disaster reminiscent of Custer's fate at Little Bighorn. Yet the stakes left no room for delay. Munsan-ni, a vital rail and road hub, controlled access to river crossings, valley approaches, and the high ground that overlooked Seoul's northern defenses. Whoever held it would dominate the entire sector. As midnight passed and the 23rd of March approached, officers walked the long rows of aircraft, giving last-minute instruction. Each man carried up to 125 pounds of gear, rifle or carbine, grenades, extra ammunition, and a parachute rig that would drop them into darkness at 600 feet. The tension was electric but disciplined. At 7:15 a.m., engines roared to full power. The first wave of C-119 lumbered down the runway, lifting into cold blue skies toward enemy territory. Behind them, more than 3,400 paratroopers, and Rangers waited their turn, the thunder of propellers mixing with the pounding of hearts. They were about to make only the second combat parachute jump in U.S. Army history, trusting that the tanks of Task Force Growdon could fight through mines and ambushes in time. Ahead lay the unknown misdrops, hidden mortars, and hills bristling with Chinese and North Korean guns. Operation Tomahawk was in motion. At 9 a.m. on the 23rd of March, 1951, the skies over Munsan-ni filled with the drone of more than 120 transport aircraft. One by one, the rear doors yawned open, and streams of American paratroopers hurled themselves into the wind. Silk canopies blossomed against the pale sky. Operation Tomahawk had begun. But almost immediately, something went wrong. The lead aircraft in the formation suffered engine trouble and aborted its run. The following pilots had been given only one simple order: drop on the lead plane's mark. With no marker to follow, they had to guess. The result was chaos. The entire 1st Battalion came down nearly 5 miles north of their intended zone, right on top of the area already assigned to the 3rd Battalion. The drop zone was overcrowded, soldiers colliding in the air and on the ground, weapons and gear scattered across rice paddies. Confusion reigned, but training and discipline prevailed. Within hours, both battalions had rallied and were pushing toward their objective. Major Ronald C. Spears, later famous for his service with the 506th in Europe, recalled, "The Northern DZ was initially saturated with personnel due to the 1st Battalion's accidental drop. This hampered the assembly of the 3rd Battalion. But the DZ was secured. 40 to 50 enemies were killed or wounded." By 12:15 p.m., the paratroopers had organized into fighting formations. The enemy elements of North Korean units, supported by Chinese mortars, had already begun harassing them with small arms and indirect fire. The 4th Ranger Company, jumping alongside the 3rd Battalion, immediately moved against Hill 205, a jagged ridge overlooking 2 key fords on the Imjin River. If the enemy held it, they could reinforce or escape at will. The Rangers assembled near the hamlet of Uijeongbu, under constant inaccurate mortar fire, then launched their assault up the feature they had nicknamed the Fingers. Initial progress was swift. 2 platoons seized ridges without opposition, but as the 1st platoon climbed the summit, defenders opened up with heavy fire. Ammunition dwindled, forcing men to fight with rifle butts and bayonets. By noon, the platoon had to withdraw, dragging 13 wounded comrades with them. Captain Dorsey Anderson, commanding the Rangers, rotated in 2nd Platoon and called in airstrikes. F-51 Mustangs screamed in, rockets flashing against the hillside. But the strikes were premature, catching the Rangers too close. When the smoke cleared, the enemy's bunkers were still intact. By mid-afternoon, with platoons out of ammunition and pinned down by overlapping fire from Hill 200 and Hill 208, Anderson ordered a pullback. The Rangers dug in for the night, still under fire. Elsewhere, Company I of the 3rd Battalion had struck out early for Hill 86, capturing it in just 30 minutes, killing 8 and capturing 21 prisoners. To the south, Captain Miller's 2nd Platoon of the 3rd Battalion launched a brutal firefight to clear Hill 216. Though an airstrike had hammered the position earlier, survivors fought fiercely. After an hour-long battle, the Americans seized the hill and began directing fire support across the countryside. At this moment, General Matthew Ridgway himself arrived on the battlefield. Flying in aboard a light aircraft, he landed amid sporadic mortar fire to establish his command post. Ridgway refused to lead from the rear. His first CP came under fire, forcing a quick relocation, but he remained close to the drop zone, personally issuing orders and steadying the men. For the 1st Battalion, scattered and isolated, the situation was especially dangerous. One plane load had landed directly amid Chinese troops on Hill 216 and the adjacent ridge. Under heavy fire, they called in close air support. A punishing strike silenced enemy mortars long enough for the survivors to rally and push out from the drop zone. By evening, the Americans had secured the DZ and driven the enemy off the immediate hills, but the cost was high. The 4th Rangers had fought all day for Hill 205 without success. The paratroopers were under constant, harassing mortar fire. Ammunition was running low, and Task Force Growdon, the mechanized column meant to relieve them within 24 hours, was still bogged down miles to the south, picking its way through minefields. As darkness fell on the 23rd of March, the men of the 187th dug in among the ridges and rice paddies of Munsan-ni. They had survived their chaotic drop, they had bloodied the enemy, but they knew the hardest fighting was still ahead. While paratroopers fought to hold their scattered positions around Munsan-ni, Task Force Growdon, the armored fist meant to relieve them, struggled through a gauntlet of obstacles. Lieutenant Colonel John Growdon's column rolled out of Seoul at 5:30 a.m., the 23rd of March. It included M46 Patton tanks, self-propelled artillery, engineers, and even British Churchill bridge layers, more than enough firepower to smash through conventional resistance. But the enemy had seeded every mile with hidden dangers. Just after dawn, the first 2 tanks rumbled across the small Changnung River unscathed. The 3rd tank wasn't so lucky. A buried Chinese mine exploded beneath its treads, blowing it apart and halting the column. Sappers swept the road, only to find scrap metal hubcaps and tin cans deliberately buried to trigger false alarms and slow the advance. Growdon tried to outflank the threat. At 11A, a tank platoon pushed ahead through a dry riverbed, only to hit another field of mines within minutes. As dusk approached, the force had advanced barely a handful of miles. Radio contact with the 187th finally came at 5:30 p.m., but more mines and heavy small arms and mortar fire made further progress agonizingly slow. By the time Growdon's armor reached Munsan-ni at 5 a.m., on the 24th of March, they had lost 4 M46 tanks, 1 quarter-ton truck, and an armored car, with 2 more tanks disabled by artillery. The rendezvous was almost 12 hours late, too late to seal the Imjin River crossings the Chinese used to slip away. Yet the link-up brought desperately needed supplies, ammunition, food, and medical aid. More importantly, it allowed Ridgway to press the next phase, an eastward drive to cut off retreating communist columns. That night, under driving rain and fading light, the 187th Regimental Combat Team began its push east. Roads dissolved into rivers of mud, vehicles bogged down. By dawn on the 25th of March, soaked and exhausted, the column finally struck the enemy near Sinchon. Surprise favored the Americans. The Chinese had arrayed their defenses to repel an attack from the south, not the west. As U.S. troops pressed forward, the defenders fell back toward the village of Parun-ni. There, the communists turned to fight. It was in the storm-shrouded paddies around Parun-ni that 2 men, Gunnery Sergeant Irvin Muldoon and Private First Class Eugene Estep, etched their names into history. At 1 p.m., after hours of skirmishing in torrential rain and lightning, waves of Chinese soldiers launched a massive counterattack against Company G. Most American rifles, carbines, and even BARs were waterlogged and misfiring. Machine guns jammed. For many men, grenades and bayonets became the only reliable weapons. From an exposed, coverless position, Muldoon managed to keep 2 heavy machine guns dry and in action. Calmly directing fire across the front and both flanks, he broke up assault after assault. When gunners around him fell wounded, he grabbed their weapons and fired himself, cutting down attackers at point-blank range. Nearby, Estep showed equal valor. Seeing an enemy concentration forming, he seized a .30 caliber gun, dragged it to a better angle, and unleashed sweeping bursts until he too was mortally wounded. For 45 relentless minutes, these 2 soldiers held the line almost single-handedly, their guns roaring above the thunder and the shouts of charging Chinese troops. Sergeant Earl Heinebaugh, who witnessed the action, later said, "It wasn't just that he personally killed a lot of the enemy, it was the leadership he displayed that broke the back of the Chinese attack." Both Muldoon and Estep were posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, their heroism ensuring that the line held. By late afternoon, the Chinese attack had collapsed. Survivors fled east under the cover of darkness and pouring rain. The Rakkasans gave chase, clashing again outside Parun-ni in a day-long firefight that forced the enemy from surrounding ridges. Only when the skies finally cleared on the evening of the 25th of March did the men pause, cleaning rifles and machine guns caked with mud, preparing for the next thrust. But Ridgway's vision was not yet complete. To truly cut off the enemy's retreat, the 187th needed to seize the commanding height of Hill 228, which overlooked the vital Uijeongbu Road, the last major escape route for Chinese and North Korean forces. After days of relentless fighting through rain, mud, and lightning, the men of the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team turned toward their final and most critical objective, Hill 228. This rugged height dominated the Uijeongbu Road, the main escape route for Chinese and North Korean forces retreating east. If the Americans could seize and hold it, they would finally slam the door on the enemy column and secure a decisive victory for Operation Tomahawk. At dawn on the 26th of March, 1951, the Rakkasans began their advance. The sky opened once more, drenching men and weapons alike, slowing the pace to a crawl. Despite the punishing rain, Ridgway's order was clear: reach Hill 228 and cut the road before the enemy could slip away. By nightfall, the regiment was still 3 miles short of the objective. But when the morning of the 27th of March broke bright and clear, the paratroopers pushed forward with renewed determination. The plan called for a direct assault by the 1st and 3rd Battalions, while the 2nd Battalion screened the northern flank. From the outset, the approach was grueling. 8 hours were spent clearing entrenched outposts and knocking out hidden mortars and machine gun nests just to reach the base of the hill. At noon, with supporting fire from artillery and F-80 Shooting Street R-jets, the final climb began. The southern slopes were too steep to scale, forcing the assault force to swing around to the northern approach. There, about 400 Chinese soldiers held a labyrinth of foxholes and bunkers, lavishly supplied with grenades and small arms. Wave after wave of Rakkasans stormed upward. Mud sucked at their boots. Ammunition again ran low. But American soldiers turned to an old weapon, the bayonet charge. Veterans later recalled that Chinese troops often abandoned their positions rather than face hand-to-hand combat with the larger, determined Americans. One hilltop trench after another fell. By late afternoon, just as the Americans prepared to push for the summit, their own shortage of small arms ammunition forced a halt. Darkness and worsening conditions made further attacks impossible. From above, Communist artillery emplacements on the Uijeongbu Road shelled their positions until dusk. Then, a lifeline. A cargo plane braved enemy fire to drop crates of ammunition with pinpoint accuracy onto the hillside. The men dug in, cleaning rifles and checking gear under the cold stars, ready to finish the fight at first light. At 7 a.m. on the 28th of March, the assault resumed. Enemy artillery opened up from the road, but U.S. counter-battery fire silenced the guns by mid-afternoon. The Rakkasans pressed their advantage. By evening, Hill 228 was theirs. Simultaneously, additional elements of the regiment seized Hill 148 to the east and cleared a chain of smaller ridges, eliminating the last pockets of resistance. In a single day, 237 enemy soldiers were killed and 20 captured. By the 29th of March, a Belgian battalion moved up to reinforce the exhausted Americans, cementing control of the Uijeongbu Road. The Chinese and North Korean forces, battered and divided, had no choice but to break contact and retreat farther north. Operation Tomahawk had succeeded. In less than a week, the 187th Regimental Combat Team, supported by Rangers, artillery, and Task Force Growdon, had killed or wounded an estimated 4,200 enemy troops, secured key terrain, and closed the main escape corridor north of Seoul. Their victory not only neutralized a looming offensive, but also enabled subsequent United Nations operations, including Operation Rigged, which struck deeper into the strategic Iron Triangle. Yet the cost was heavy. Many Americans had fallen, including heroes like Gunnery Sergeant Irvin Muldoon and Private First Class Eugene Estep, whose last stands at Munsan-ni became legendary in airborne history. Still, their sacrifice ensured that the Chinese and North Korean forces threatening Seoul were shattered and scattered. Operation Tomahawk, boldly conceived and brilliantly executed, proved that a well-planned airborne assault could change the course of a campaign even in the age of jet aircraft and mechanized armies. The road to Uijeongbu was cut, the enemy offensive was stopped, and the Rakhassans of the 187th had written one of the final and finest chapters of combat parachute history in the Korean War. When the guns finally fell silent at the end of March 1951, the hills and valleys around Munsan-ni told the story of a decisive victory. Operation Tomahawk had met every critical objective. The 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team, backed by Rangers, artillery, and the hard-driving columns of Task Force Growdon, had killed or wounded more than 4,200 enemy soldiers, seized key high ground, and cut the Uijeongbu Road, the last major escape route for Chinese and North Korean forces north of Seoul. The immediate result was to shatter a massive communist offensive before it could begin. Intelligence had warned General Matthew Ridgway that Chinese and North Korean armies were preparing a spring strike designed to retake Seoul. Instead, thanks to the speed and determination of the paratroopers and supporting armor, that offensive never materialized. Operation Tomahawk also enabled the follow-on Operation Rigged, which further dismantled enemy logistics in the so-called Iron Triangle, the vital transportation hub bordered by Chorwon, Pyongyang, and Kumhwa. By seizing the initiative and forcing the enemy onto the defensive, Ridgway's strategy bought the United Nations command valuable time and leverage at the negotiating table, helping to set the stage for the armistice talks that began later that year. But the success was written in blood as well as strategy. Heroes such as Gunnery Sergeant Irvin Muldoon and Private First Class Eugene Estep, who stood their ground at Munsan-ni when weapons failed and the enemy came in waves, embodied the courage that turned Ridgway's plan from a gamble into a triumph. Both were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, their names forever etched into the proud lineage of the airborne. For the Rakhassans of the 187th, Operation Tomahawk was more than a mission, it was a defining moment. It became the last combat parachute assault of the Korean War and one of the few large-scale airborne operations in American history. Veterans would later say that the experience proved that airborne forces properly trained, supplied, and supported could still deliver decisive blows even in an era dominated by tanks, jet aircraft, and heavy artillery. Today, the rice paddies where paratroopers once fought through mud and lightning storms lie quiet, their scars softened by time and new harvests. Yet the echoes of March 1951 remain. The hills of 205, 216, and 228 still rise over the Imjin, silent witnesses to a week when courage and rapid action bent the course of a war. Operation Tomahawk was more than a tactical success. It was a testament to the ingenuity of commanders who refused to surrender the initiative, and to the grit of soldiers who jumped into uncertainty and fought with bayonet and bare hands when technology failed. Their stand ensured that the United Nations retained control of Seoul, blunted a renewed enemy offensive, and gave diplomacy a chance to take hold. 70 years later, the story of Tomahawk endures an airborne strike that fused daring strategy with unshakable courage and proved that even in the jet age, the decisive element on the battlefield remains the will of the men who fight.